Hello, my name is Professor Sharon McLeod, and I'm speaking on behalf of my colleagues Dr. Sarah Verdon, Dr. Audrey Wang, and Dr. Van Trun. Our presentation today is titled Vietnamese Language Use, Proficiency, and Intergenerational Transmission in Australia. We'd like to acknowledge project funding for our Viet Speech project from the Australian Research Discovery Grant and also Dr. Van Trun's Australian Postgraduate Award Scholarship. You can find out more details about our Viet Speech project at the website below. Vietnamese is the 18th most commonly spoken language in the world, according to Ethnologue. It's the official language of Vietnam with over 92 million speakers, but is also commonly spoken in many other countries, including the US, Canada, Australia, the UK, the Czech Republic, France, and other countries. In the US, there are an estimated 1.5 million Vietnamese, with large communities in California and Texas. In Australia, 1.2% of the population speaks Vietnamese at home, and it's ranked in the top 5 languages spoken in Australia. The Vietnamese diaspora has occurred in two ways. Firstly, as boat people due to the American-Vietnamese War, and secondly, as plain people, frequently for education and jobs. Currently, there's little known about home language maintenance practice among Vietnamese diaspora in Australia or around the world. Now, as we know, a shift in language dominance amongst immigrants is said to occur within 3 generations. The Vietnamese community in Australia is at a key point in time in terms of the maintenance of their home language. For your background information, Australia does not have an official language, but English is the language of government, economy, education, and daily life. And Australians are said to have a monolingual mindset towards English, with only about 20%, just over 20% of our population speaking a language other than English at home. There are many benefits of multilingualism. These include having a cognitive advantage, social and cultural cohesion, a sense of identity, academic, occupational, and economic advantage over monolingual peers. To provide more detail about this final point, my colleagues and I have undertaken an analysis of 2 Australian census data sets of over 20 million people each time, or approximately 20 million people each time. We found that Australians who spoke English well, plus another language, were more likely to have a job, have a higher degree, and have a higher income than monolingual English-speaking Australians. In contrast, Australians who did not speak English well and spoke another language were less likely to have a job, have a higher degree, and have a higher income than monolingual English-speaking Australians. We have undertaken work to consider the factors affecting home language maintenance. These can be grouped into 4 areas. The child factors, including the age, the sex of the child, the birth order, migration status, the timing of commencement of education, and so forth. Parent factors include home language input, the attitude towards home language maintenance, language proficiency of the parents, and perception of identity. Family factors include the presence of siblings and contact with grandparents and relatives. And finally, community factors include the home language communities that are close by, home language schools, home language immersed education, teacher peer influence, and religion. So the aim of this research was to describe factors supporting language use, language proficiency, and home language maintenance amongst the Vietnamese community in Australia. Our participants were 271 Australian Vietnamese adults. 76.6% were first generation immigrants. The data were collected via self-report questionnaire that was created from a comprehensive literature review. The questionnaire was available in both Vietnamese and English and could be completed online or in hard copy. We analysed the quantitative data using a cluster analysis in SPSS and the extended response data in NVivo. So to look at the results of our study, Vietnamese was the first language of 94.3% of our participants. It was the most proficient language of 78.5% of our participants. When you break down the differences between oral and written languages spoken, you can see in the graph that the orange bars represent oral language and the grey bars represent written language. You can see that Vietnamese was spoken well or very well by 92.8% of the participants, whereas English was spoken very well or well by 72% of the participants. And the written capacity of the participants was slightly lower than their oral capacity in each language. We undertook a bivariate analysis to consider the factors that were significantly associated with their language proficiency. We found that these factors were associated: their age, income, education, years in English-speaking countries, their language use, language maintenance, cultural identity, and cultural connection. We then undertook a cluster analysis to create 3 cluster profiles that were statistically identified. Cluster 1 were those participants who were proficient in both Vietnamese and English, and this comprised 52% of our 271 participants. Cluster 2 were those who were most proficient in Vietnamese, and Cluster 3 were those who were most proficient in English, and there were 17% of those in that cluster. Then we undertook multinomial logistic regression analyses to compare, first of all, clusters 1 and 2. So cluster 1 were those who were proficient in Vietnamese and English, and cluster 2 were those most proficient in Vietnamese. Those who were most proficient in Vietnamese believed that Vietnamese helped their English communication, and they were a group who was likely to have a lower income. Then we compared Cluster 1, those proficient in Vietnamese and English, with Cluster 3, those most proficient in English. And we found that Cluster 3 were younger, had lived longer in English-speaking countries, and were less likely to believe that Vietnamese improved their academic study. When we considered the participants' language use, they mostly used Vietnamese at home with their mother, father, older siblings, Vietnamese-speaking grandparents, relatives in Vietnam, and Vietnamese friends. They mostly used English when working, studying, and watching TV, and used Vietnamese and English with their partners, children, younger siblings, English-speaking grandparents, and in social media. We asked the participants about language maintenance. They felt that the most important reasons for maintaining Vietnamese were to maintain bonds with relatives, maintain Vietnamese cultural identity, and maintain friendships. The strategies used to maintain Vietnamese were using only Vietnamese with family and friends and choosing to read, watch, and listen to Vietnamese media. So these Vietnamese Australians could be divided into 3 clusters based on their language proficiency. Proficiency in both Vietnamese and English was significantly impacted by beliefs about language maintenance. Oral multilingualism was supported by conversation and media exposure. And social media played an important role in maintaining written multilingualism. Maintaining Vietnamese was key for a sense of identity and participation in family and community. These findings provide language-specific data to support culturally responsive practice when working with multilingual people of Vietnamese Australian heritage. We found that choice of language depends on the context of communication and beliefs about language maintenance. We advocate that a detailed language profile is essential to avoid assumptions about language use and language preference. We have published one paper about this work in the Journal of Monolingual and Bilingual Speech and have another paper about this work currently in submission. We encourage you to have a look at our Viet Speech website and to follow the other projects that we are undertaking, including the running of speech and language maintenance groups for young Vietnamese Australian children in Australia. Thank you for your attention, and we look forward to hearing from you at the attached email if you have any questions.